Hollywood itself. And while the film featured multiple legendary performances, James Caan's portrayal of Sonny Corleone stood out with ferocious clarity. Sonny was impulsive, explosive, fiercely loyal, and dangerously emotional. Caan didn't play him as a caricature of rage. He infused him with vulnerability beneath the aggression. The famous toll booth scene remains one of the most shocking deaths in cinematic history, not just because of its violence, but because audiences had grown attached to Sonny's reckless humanity. In that moment, Caan achieved something rare. He made volatility sympathetic. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination and instantly elevated him into the top tier of Hollywood actors. But here lies the paradox. The very traits that made Sonny unforgettable, intensity, aggression, emotional fire, became inseparable from Caan's public identity. Casting directors saw Sonny. Audiences saw Sonny. Even interviews framed him through that lens. Ask yourself this carefully. When the world falls in love with a version of you that is heightened and extreme, how do you return to being ordinary? The 70s, fame, pressure, and expectation. The 1970s should have been the decade that solidified Caan as a long-term leading man. He had momentum, credibility, and visibility. Films like Cinderella Liberty, Rollerball, and The Gambler showcased his range, from romantic vulnerability to existential frustration. Yet something complicated began unfolding beneath the surface. Caan was no longer just acting intense characters. He was being expected to live intensely. Hollywood in the 1970s was notorious for excess, and Caan moved within circles where indulgence was normalized. Substance use, late nights, high-stakes gambling, and constant social activity blurred the boundaries between performance and identity. The industry rewarded bravado, and Caan's natural edge made him a magnet for both opportunity and risk. He later admitted that during this period, Hollywood itself. And while the film featured multiple legendary performances, James Caan's portrayal of Sonny Corleone stood out with ferocious clarity. Sonny was impulsive, explosive, fiercely loyal, and dangerously emotional. Caan didn't play him as a caricature of rage. He infused him with vulnerability beneath the aggression. The famous toll booth scene remains one of the most shocking deaths in cinematic history, not just because of its violence, but because audiences had grown attached to Sonny's reckless humanity. In that moment, Caan achieved something rare. He made volatility sympathetic. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination and instantly elevated him into the top tier of Hollywood actors. But here lies the paradox. The very traits that made Sonny unforgettable, intensity, aggression, emotional fire, became inseparable from Caan's public identity. Casting directors saw Sonny. Audiences saw Sonny. Even interviews framed him through that lens. Ask yourself this carefully. When the world falls in love with a version of you that is heightened and extreme, how do you return to being ordinary? The 70s, fame, pressure, and expectation. The 1970s should have been the decade that solidified Caan as a long-term leading man. He had momentum, credibility, and visibility. Films like Cinderella Liberty, Rollerball, and The Gambler showcased his range, from romantic vulnerability to existential frustration. Yet something complicated began unfolding beneath the surface. Caan was no longer just acting intense characters. He was being expected to live intensely. Hollywood in the 1970s was notorious for excess, and Caan moved within circles where indulgence was normalized. Substance use, late nights, high-stakes gambling, and constant social activity blurred the boundaries between performance and identity. The industry rewarded bravado, and Caan's natural edge made him a magnet for both opportunity and risk. He later admitted that during this period, personal loss and emotional collapse. In 1981, James Caan experienced a devastating personal tragedy when his sister died of leukemia. This loss profoundly affected him, deepening existing emotional instability and pushing him toward withdrawal. He later described feeling lost, disconnected, and unmotivated. The combination of grief and lifestyle excess took its toll. Unlike dramatic public meltdowns that attract headlines, Caan's unraveling was subtle but damaging. Roles slowed. Offers became less prestigious. His reliability came into question. Hollywood, always impatient, began shifting attention to newer faces. The man who once seemed indispensable became optional. And that is the cruelty of the industry. It rarely waits for someone to recover. The long hiatus, disappearing at the height of fame. During the 1980s, Caan's presence in major films diminished significantly. Some described it as a hiatus, others as career decline. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. He stepped away partly by circumstance and partly by necessity. Substance use issues and personal struggles made sustained performance difficult. Yet there was also a deeper exhaustion, a fatigue from constantly being expected to embody intensity. This period reveals something critical about Caan's story. He was not destroyed by scandal or public disgrace. Instead, he drifted, and drifting in Hollywood can be just as final as collapse. Without a defining reinvention, without a carefully orchestrated comeback narrative, the industry simply moves on. Ask yourself this: how many talented people fade, not because they fail spectacularly, but because they lose momentum quietly? The comeback that was never quite complete. Caan eventually returned to prominence in the 1990s, most notably with Misery in 1990, where he played a restrained and vulnerable novelist held captive. The performance reminded audiences that beneath the volatility was subtlety and restraint. Later roles in films like Elf. Conclusion: the cost of peaking too soon. James Caan reminds us that explosive success carries unique risks. When fame arrives before emotional stability, when identity fuses too tightly with one role, when intensity becomes expectation rather than choice, the path forward narrows. He will always be Sonny Corleone to millions. But behind that iconic performance was a man navigating grief, pressure, excess, reinvention, and regret. And perhaps the most human part of his story is not the rise or the struggle, but the persistence, the refusal to disappear entirely. So the final question is this: if you were remembered forever for one moment at the height of your youth, would it feel like immortality or like a cage? Hollywood's typecasting trap. One of the quiet struggles James Caan faced after The Godfather was the industry's inability to see him beyond controlled volatility. Casting directors often sought him out for roles that mirrored Sonny's intensity, reinforcing a narrow version of masculinity that left little room for softness or reinvention. While Caan possessed comedic timing and emotional nuance, Hollywood frequently defaulted to what was already proven profitable. Over time, that repetition can distort an actor's identity, because when the world only rewards one dimension of you, you begin to question whether the others matter. Caan once expressed frustration that audiences rarely recognize the vulnerability beneath his tougher roles, and that frustration speaks to a broader truth about stardom. Success can reduce complexity instead of expanding it. Ask yourself this honestly: how many people become trapped inside the strongest version of themselves simply because it is the version others applaud the loudest? The toll of reputation. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, James Caan's reputation had begun working against him. Stories of unpredictability, clashes, and excess followed him, whether exaggerated or not, and Hollywood can be unforgiving. Introduced him to a new generation, proving his adaptability and enduring screen presence. Yet even with these successes, Caan never fully escaped the shadow of Sonny Corleone. Interviews often circled back to The Godfather, reinforcing the idea that his greatest moment had occurred early. While many actors struggle to achieve one iconic role, Caan struggled to outgrow his. There is something bittersweet about that reality. He had depth, range, and charisma, yet history often compresses him into a single explosive character. Ask yourself this carefully: is being remembered for one extraordinary moment enough, or does it quietly erase everything that followed? Fatherhood, reflection, and late-life honesty. In later years, Caan became more reflective, particularly regarding fatherhood and the mistakes of his earlier life. His relationships, including multiple marriages, reflected the instability of his middle years. But he also spoke openly about regret and growth, acknowledging the chaos that once defined him. He never fully embraced the polished humility of a rebranded elder statesman. Instead, he retained blunt honesty. That honesty, sometimes abrasive, sometimes refreshing, revealed a man who had stopped pretending to be anything other than himself. There is dignity in that refusal. Legacy, more than just Sonny. When James Caan passed away in 2022, tributes poured in emphasizing his unforgettable turn in The Godfather. But those who looked closer remembered something more layered. A performer who captured volatility without losing humanity, a man whose early peak shaped both his rise and his struggles. Caan's life is not a simple cautionary tale about excess, nor is it a straightforward tragedy. It is the story of someone who achieved cinematic immortality early and then spent decades negotiating what that immortality meant. He did not collapse completely, nor did he dominate endlessly. He lived in the complicated space between triumph and turbulence. Once doubt enters the conversation, in an industry built on financial risk, reliability becomes currency, and even the perception of instability can quietly close doors. Caan was not the only actor of his era to struggle with this shift, but for someone whose identity was already tied to intensity, the line between performance and personality blurred easily in public perception. The man who once embodied fearless dominance now faced a subtler battle, proving he could sustain discipline over time. And perhaps the deeper challenge was internal, believing he deserved continued opportunity despite earlier chaos. Ask yourself carefully, when reputation begins to overshadow talent, how does a person reclaim control of their narrative? Redemption without reinvention. Unlike some of his peers who rebranded themselves entirely, James Caan never attempted a dramatic reinvention. His later performances carried echoes of the same energy that defined his youth, but softened by experience and age. In films like Misery, audiences glimpsed restraint and quiet fear beneath the surface toughness, proving that the depth had always been there. Yet Caan did not chase award season campaigns or dramatic transformations to reshape his legacy. Instead, he seemed to accept his place in cinematic history as it was flawed, iconic, and incomplete. That acceptance may be the most telling aspect of his later years. He did not fight the shadow of Sonny endlessly. He learned to live alongside it. And that invites a final reflection. Is true redemption found in reinvention, or in the courage to face your past without pretending it never defined you? The man who peaked too fast. How James Caan became a star overnight and spent decades escaping it. Introduction. The problem with explosive success. Some actors rise slowly, building careers brick by brick until success feels earned and stable. Others explode into fame so quickly that there is no time to prepare for what it demands. James Caan belonged firmly to the second category. In the early 1970s, he became one of the most magnetic and intense performers in Hollywood, embodying a kind of raw masculinity that audiences found irresistible. But what happens when the role that makes you immortal also traps you permanently inside it? What happens when your defining moment arrives too early, too powerfully, and too publicly? As you listen to this story, consider something uncomfortable. Is it possible for success to arrive before a person is emotionally ready to carry it? Before The Godfather, hunger and ambition. Before global fame, James Caan was driven by hunger, not arrogance. Born in the Bronx and raised in Queens, he grew up surrounded by toughness, competition, and the pressure to prove himself. Acting was not a glamorous dream at first. It was a path toward recognition, toward being seen. He studied at Hofstra University and trained seriously, developing discipline and craft rather than relying purely on charisma. In the 1960s, Caan began appearing in television and smaller film roles, slowly gaining attention for his intensity. He worked alongside respected directors and actors, including Francis Ford Coppola in The Rain People, which would later prove significant. Caan wasn't yet a star, but he had something directors noticed immediately: volatility under control. There was energy in him, something unpredictable, something that could ignite a scene without overwhelming it. That spark would soon define him forever. Sonny Corleone, the role that changed everything. When The Godfather premiered in 1972, it did more than launch careers. It reshaped